I'm not clear where I'm going.
Right here. There we go.
Go!
Whoa! It's exciting.
I don't know how I got twisted up like this, but I'm not.
There you go.
I gotta tell you, man, this is one of the more difficult what you call jobs in my life.
Oh, I don't know about you, but I've always liked Mike Rowe. He makes me laugh. Whether it's on Dirtiest Jobs or The Deadliest Catch, there's just something about the way that he has respected what people do for their work, the impact they have, even if it's a messy, dirty job. But I just love the way that he has shown people doing their job. And today, that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what we're going to dive into a little bit today of when God meets us in our work. So, I like sports quite a bit. I used to work in sports, so I figured, hey, let's start off with a story. Let's start off with a story about a guy who works in sports. So we're going to start off with the guy who played baseball. Any baseball fans? I see a baseball jersey. Thanks for raising your hand. We got some baseball fans. Twins won last night, extra innings. We'll take that. That's a good thing. But this isn't about the Twins. This is about a guy that played for the Chicago Cubs. Any Cubs fans? Ooh, I guess they were all at the 9 o'clock. So he ended his career with the Chicago Cubs. His name is David Ross. He's actually the manager for the Chicago Cubs right now. And in baseball, I don't know why, but they call the coach the manager. So he's the manager for the Chicago Cubs. And then when he started his career out, he was like many baseball players. He didn't start with the Cubs. He kind of bounced around the major leagues. He's playing for this team for a couple years. Then he played for that team for a couple years. And then he got a job, but he earned the job to be the starting catcher for the Cincinnati Reds. Everything was going well. He was hitting the ball well. He was playing well offensively. He was playing well defensively. And then somewhere in there, the Cincinnati Reds, they hired a different manager, a guy by the name of Dusty Baker. And it didn't go so well because you see, David Ross and Dusty Baker, they didn't see eye to eye. They're kind of like oil and water. They just really didn't mix together so well. It all came to a head towards the end of a season. It was the 8th inning in a game, and Dusty Baker pulled David Ross out of the game. Took him out of the game. And in baseball, you usually don't pull your catcher in the middle of an inning unless he's hurt or there's something extraordinary going on. After the game, you can only imagine what David Ross was thinking. He wasn't too happy. He wasn't too excited. So he's going to find Dusty Baker, see what's going on. So he storms into his office. And he's like, "Why did you pull me out?" And he was all fired up. Dusty Baker looked at David Ross and said, "You come into my office, you're all fired up because you got pulled out of the game. You didn't come into my office all fired up because our team lost the game. And that's a problem." Well, you can guess that David Ross was no longer part of the Cincinnati Reds after that. So he went home, and you can only imagine what it feels like after you get fired. You probably got some anger, maybe a little bit of regret, probably some fear. Just thinking, hey, I need a job. I need to provide for my family. And will I get a job doing what I want to do? David Ross chose to play baseball, and there was no guarantee that he was ever going to get to play baseball again. So he went home and just had that feeling. A feeling I'm sure we've all had at some point or another. Luckily, David Ross, he got picked up. Like I said, it was towards the end of the season, and the Boston Red Sox thought they were going to make a postseason run. They're going to have a chance to go deep into the playoffs and maybe win the World Series. They wanted a third catcher on their roster, so they signed David Ross to be their third string catcher. Season didn't end the way the Red Sox wanted, ended a little sooner than they had planned on. And David Ross knew it wasn't a long-term deal. And the manager knew it wasn't a long-term deal either. But he liked David Ross, so he brought David Ross into his office, and he wanted to help David Ross out. He said, David, there's something you need to know. You have a bad reputation in Major League Baseball. People think you're a bad teammate. If you're ever going to catch on, you're ever going to have a career in this league, you've got to work. You've got to work to change that perception. So David Ross, he went home without a job again, and probably a pit in his stomach, thinking, hey, the profession, the area, the place I want to work, they all think I'm a bad teammate. That's not good. So as I'm sharing this story about David Ross, I believe that God had a plan for David Ross. He eventually got picked up the next year by the Atlanta Braves. And during training camp, he made a decision. He made a decision that he was going to overcome that reputation as a bad teammate. So every day in the start of training camp, that's before the season starts, he sat in the athletic training room, and that's the room all the players go into. They need ice, they need a Band-Aid, they need an ankle tape, something's wrong. That's where they go to see the medical personnel. And he put a chair by the door, and he brought a whiteboard with him. And every person that walked into that athletic training room, he asked them a question. He said, what makes a great teammate? When they answered, David Ross wrote it on the whiteboard, and people started looking at what he had written down, and they added things. After training camp, David Ross had a list of what it took to be a great teammate. And sure enough, David Ross committed himself to doing the things that were on that list, and he became known. He became known as a great teammate. He bounced around a little bit more, and he finally landed with the Chicago Cubs. And as the catcher for the Chicago Cubs, he caught a no-hitter. He hit his 100th home run. Not everybody does that in the major leagues. And eventually, in the 7th game of the World Series, well, this happened. You got to take a look.
Just 63 pitches. Ross flies one into center, sends Davis back at the wall. He's gone! The 39-year-old in his final game, David Ross, has made it 6-3.
I mean, David Ross hit a home run in the 7th game of the World Series to give his team the lead. How awesome of a feeling did that have to be? The Cubs eventually went on to win that game, and they won the World Series for the first time in like 108 years. It was forever. And a couple years later, David Ross, he was named the manager of the Chicago Cubs. As I shared with you earlier, I believe that God had a plan for David Ross. He met him in a specific time, in a specific place, and with specific people. And that path, it wasn't easy. In fact, David said later on in an interview, if I can affect or change one life by helping someone realize that I'm not perfect, that I've had trials, and God sends us through trials, good and bad, I just want people to see that and know that. Because it's pretty obvious David Ross had trials that were good and bad. And I think you, and I think you, and you, and you, and you, all of us and me, we have trials. Some are good, some are bad. I also think that God meets us in a specific place, in a specific time, with specific people, through the good and bad. I mean, just think about David Ross. If Dusty Baker hadn't cut him, would David Ross have hit the home run in his last ever at-bat as a professional baseball player in the 7th game of the World Series? Maybe. Maybe not. But I do think, just like David Ross, I think that God meets us in a specific time, in a specific place, in specific people, because he has a plan for us. And just like David Ross, we have the opportunity to lean into that. Are we going to lean into it and meet God where he's trying to meet us? As we dive into that today, the first question that we're going to try and answer and that we're going to look at is, how does God view work? What does that look like? What is God thinking about work? So if you open up the Bible, and the first book of the Bible is Genesis, and in it, God created man. And he created man in his own image. He created us to be like God. He wanted us to be morally and spiritually and intellectually like him. And what I want us all to get out of that is when God created us, he saw us in him. And that's important as we get to the next part. So I'm going to go a little bit further into Genesis. We're just going to go to the next chapter. In Genesis 2:3, it's written, "Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." See, when God created the heavens and the earth, that was work. God was working. God worked. And then he created a day of rest. But God worked. And if we're made in his image, we're supposed to work too. So just think about that day of rest. God worked for 6 days, then he had a day of rest. Anybody in here ever have something that you've accomplished and then you celebrated a little bit? I'll tell you, last Thursday I had a project, I got it done, and I was ready to rest. I was ready to celebrate. So I go home, I'm like, hey, let's go to Dairy Queen, let's get blizzards, kids. And I was fired up about it. One of my kids was, the other one decided not to go. So all that meant was I had to eat their blizzard. So I had 2 blizzards when we went to Dairy Queen. I celebrated and I rested. There's no doubt about that. You know, that's that piece out of Genesis about 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested. I just want you to know it's okay when you read your Bible to wonder a little bit, because I was wondering, God rested. What did that look like? How did God rest? I know how I rest, but how did God rest? I mean, did he just kick back and go, whew, that continent, that island down there at the bottom, what we'd call Australia, man, did that just really filled out the picture of the earth? Did he think that? Or did he go, that was some good thinking. You know, I kind of took a horse and made it have a really long neck. You know, I called it a giraffe. That was a good one. I mean, well, what does God do? What does God do when he's resting? And I just want to encourage you when you're reading the Bible, there's some space to wonder and think, hey, what was happening in this place and in this time? So let's think about work. So God worked, we know that. Hey, his kid worked too. Anybody in here make their kids work, or any kids in here, their parents make them work? Well, you're in good company, because God made Jesus work too. And now we know Jesus' primary work was Jesus came to earth and he died for our sins. Then he ascended into heaven. And we all have the opportunity to accept that gift. That was what Jesus' work was really known for. But he also had a job. He had another job. He was a carpenter. And we know he was a carpenter because in the Bible, as we read, and we read in the beginning of the New Testament, where lots of these 4 guys wrote what happened when Jesus was on earth. When Jesus was first starting his ministry, people didn't know what to call him, and they were trying to identify him. So several places in the New Testament, it talks about, hey, that Jesus, you know, the son of Mary, the brother of James, the carpenter. So that's how we know Jesus worked and how Jesus was a carpenter. So just think about God worked, and then his son Jesus worked. And I want to use just one last example. There's this guy named Paul in the Bible. We've heard of him. He's written many letters. He had a church job because he's the guy that really carried forward the news of Jesus and spread it out across the world. But he also had another job. You know, Paul was a tent maker. Maybe you didn't know that. We know Paul was a tent maker because he traveled, and as he wrote letters, he traveled to Corinth, and he met Aquila and Priscilla. And in the Bible, in Acts, it says he stayed with them because they were tent makers too. So just think about that. That's 3 pretty big characters, people in the Bible. You got God, you got Jesus, and you got Paul, and they all worked. Now here's another interesting thing. God, Jesus, and Paul, they all worked. And if we go back to Genesis for a second, and we go into 2:15, it says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and take care of it. So God put Adam in the Garden of Eden to work and take care of it. Because in our work, God intended that we would have purpose, something to do, and that we would have the privilege of getting to work. I said it earlier and I'll say it again. God puts us in specific times and specific places with specific people. And you might not know it when it's happening, and it's crystal clear after it happens. Just ask David Ross. Would he be the manager of the Cubs if he didn't get cut by the Reds? Maybe. Maybe not. I'm sure some of you right now are maybe thinking of a story, something happened to you, and it was a bad trial. And you didn't know why it was happening, but then you look back on it and you're like, that's why that happened. One of my moments, one of the questions I'll ask myself is, would I be standing here working for Prairie Heights and having the opportunity to impact our community if I didn't get fired as a basketball coach 21 years ago? Maybe. Maybe not. I sure didn't consider it good way back then, that's for sure. But God meets us in specific times, in specific places, with specific people. And when we're working, there's some pretty specific instructions too. So we know we're supposed to work, but how are we supposed to work? You know, Paul, that tent maker guy, he couldn't be everywhere to spread the word of Jesus. Back then, they traveled by foot and by boat and by camel. And there's a lot of ground he was trying to cover. And then Paul, unfortunately for Paul, he spent a lot of time in jail because people didn't like it when he was spreading the word of Jesus, and so he got put in jail. As a result of not being able to go everywhere he wanted and sometimes being locked up, he wrote a lot of letters. In fact, there's 3 books in the Bible that are called the prison epistles because he was in prison when he wrote those letters. And one of those letters, it was to a town, a small town called Colossae. And he wrote it, and it's called Colossians in the Bible. But he wrote a letter to the Colossians, and he just wanted them to get one thing. He wanted to explain one thing to them. If they got anything from him, it was that if you're in Jesus, you don't need anything else. If you know Jesus and you follow Jesus, you don't need anything else. And it was an important letter at the time because as things happen and as we experience today, you'll see some parallels about today and in the context I'm going to give you about back then. Jesus, he'd been on earth, then he was crucified, and then he went to heaven, and the word was spreading. And what Jesus told us to do and what he instructed us to do was spreading. But there's some people that took that, maybe twisted a little bit, added their own little flavor to it, added some rules and regulations to it. And those were called false teachings or heresy back in the time. And it was prevalent. People were living it and experiencing it. I think if we think about it, we're living and experiencing some of that today too. But Paul, he wanted to encourage that group, and he wanted to share with them, hey, follow Jesus, and that's going to be enough. Don't get distracted by all of these other things. But Paul, he wanted to be crystal clear. That wasn't all he said. He just didn't write a 3-line letter that said, hey, if you have Jesus, that's enough. He wanted to be crystal clear about some things. He wanted to make sure that there was no mistake about it. He wanted to make sure that it couldn't get twisted, that it couldn't get added to. So I'm going to go just a little bit further into his letter to the Colossians, and we're going to take a look at what Paul wrote. In 3:23, Paul wrote something that should be crystal clear to us when we're in work. It doesn't only apply when we're inside in the middle of winter and we're toasty. It applies when we're outside and we're freezing and maybe we didn't bring the right gloves. It applies when, hey, maybe your work is being at home with your kid and they're 2 and they don't really listen. You guys know what I'm talking about? It doesn't only apply when the customers are happy. It applies when, hey, the customer is wrong and then they think they're right and you get to work with them. Just listen to what Paul wrote. Whatever you do, not some of what you do, or the things that you like that you do, he wrote, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Not a lot of room for misinterpretation there. And he goes on to write, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. So working for Jesus, not the person that signs your paychecks. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it's the Lord Christ you are serving. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. And remember, you're doing it for the Lord. You're doing it for Jesus. You're not doing it for the paycheck. You're not doing it for your boss. You're doing it for God. Hear that again. When you're working, it's the Lord Christ you're working for. It's Jesus you're working for. And he wants you to work at it. Man, he wants you to do your version of getting the whiteboard and sitting in the athletic training room and asking everybody, hey, how do I be a great teammate? And then going out and doing it. That's what he's looking for. That might not look like exactly like that for you. Hey, maybe it's showing up. Maybe it's showing up for work 5 minutes early and making the coffee so there's coffee made when everybody else comes in. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is, but it's something. It's something. And unfortunately, that's not what society tells us to do today. Society talks about everything that we can get. Hey, how much can you get paid? What benefits can you get? Can you get a gym membership? How about a cell phone? All those things are good things. Don't hear me say that. Those are all good things, but they should not be the focus. They should not be the focus. Working for Jesus should be the focus. Because the idea that Paul shared is that we should work to give, not get. That's what working looks like when you're working for Jesus. I mean, just think about it. What would it look like every day if you went into work and for just a little bit longer that day than you were able to the day before, that you were able to focus on giving, not getting? You're able to focus on what the customer needed when they walked through the door, or what your partner needed in your work project, what they needed. And you focus on giving that to them. I think here's what will happen. You focus on giving, you'll get way more. You get way more than you ever would have expected. Let me tell you 2 stories. One's about a prairie hider, and one is about a woman who just retired. See, the woman who just retired, she worked for the same department store for 74 years. I hope I live to be 74, much less work in the same place for 74 years. Her name's Melba Babane, and no, that is not made up, and she just retired this past August. She started working at a Dillard's department store when she was 17 years old in 1949. And when she retired, this is what she said: to be happier at work, it's important to invest in relationships. Did you hear that? She didn't say get job promotions or get raises. She didn't say job satisfaction. She said invest in your relationships. And just the nature of the word invest, that's giving. It's putting out. It's putting into something. 74 years. Success leaves clues. There might be something there. The other story I'll tell you is about 2 prairie hiders. They're both my friends. And what makes me laugh about this story is I both heard it from them, and they had no idea I already heard it from the other person. So there's a prairie hider here, and he works with bricks and stone. I think the word is he's a mason. And he's been doing it for a while, and he's pretty good at it. And another of my friends here at Prairie Heights found out about it. And ironically, his front porch steps, it was a little messy. And he didn't know how to fix it, and frankly, he didn't want to fix it. So he asked my other friend, hey, will you come over and will you fix it? So the mason, brick guy, stone cutter, whatever you want to call him, he's like, yep, I'll come over and fix it. And he came over with the idea that he was serving his friend. He was giving him something. He was helping him with something. You know, he did the work, did it as well as he could. He charged a fair price, and he went home. Now what happened? The guy whose porch it was, he was thrilled. He was ecstatic about the quality of work, about the price that he got to pay for it, and how good it looked. So what do you think he did? He told all his friends. He told me. I don't know who else he told here. But then the next week, I'm talking to my guy, the mason. And he's like, yeah, I helped this guy out. And he told everybody, now all these people are calling me and want to know if I want side jobs to come fix their porches. He went in with it, with the idea that he was giving and he was serving his friend. And he got way more opportunity than he ever wanted. I think that's what happens. My friend, my first friend, he had the mindset to give. And he got way more than he ever expected. I'll tell you, the Bible, to me, maybe to some of you, it's kind of an intimidating book. It's big, and it's got 66 different books in it that make up the big book, and you got the Old Testament, and it's like, oh. And as I've started to read it and started to study it and try and make sense of it in my mind and in my heart, and I just encourage you, if you're reading the Bible and you want to read the Bible, just start. Just start, and it'll start to make more and more sense. And as I've been on this journey of trying to pursue Jesus by reading the Bible, a couple things have become really clear to me. One is that Jesus, he loved God. He loved our Father, his Father, our Father. He loved God. It goes back to, with all your heart, with everything you got, work for the Lord. Second thing about Jesus, and everything that he did, he was all about giving. He sure wasn't about giving. The end of his life, what did he do? He gave his life for us. You go back, and you read all the different accounts, and he sure did a lot of giving. Let me just make one more point about giving and getting. So we came in this morning. How many of you got to listen to some music that you liked? Oh, all right, we got some people that are excited. Yeah, we got some people that are excited. Now, I would also predict there's some of you that might have missed the music because I've been there, and I'm just super glad you got here today. So if you didn't get to the music, hey, just know that I am super happy you're here today. But we played some music, and it probably made you feel kind of good. Yeah, you were there, and maybe you swayed to the music. I would guess that some of you even sing along with the music. Yeah, you got it. All right. Yeah, you gotta. There's no doubt about it. And you're thinking, hey, that music, I got something from that music. What if you got it backwards? At Prairie Heights, when we start to put together what our Sunday service is going to look like, there's all the different sections, and the section of music, we call it worship. And the idea behind worship is that we're loving our Father, that we're praising and thanking, showing our appreciation. We are giving our love. What if that feeling you have, that lightheartedness you have, maybe that joy you have from the music, you're getting it because you're giving your praise? Just think about that. What are you giving? And we've talked about that God, he wants us to give, focus on giving, not getting. It's not enough. I mean, that's hard. It's hard. It's hard to do what Paul wrote in Colossians, to work with all your heart, to do it for Jesus. That's hard enough as it is. Maybe you guys don't struggle with it, but I probably struggle with it every single day, at least once an hour, maybe 60 times an hour. You just don't know. It's not easy to do. But God, he meets us in places, he meets us at times, and he meets us with people to do more than just work with all our heart. He wants more. Maybe some of you have heard this saying or heard this question. If a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? We could debate that till the cows come home. But do you see where I'm going here? Some of you do. God meets us in specific places, at specific times, with specific people to do more than work. He meets us there so that we can invite other people to know him. I know it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Hey, work. I'm here to work. Not talk about church or talk about God. Nobody does that. Yeah, that's you're living in your pastor world there, Doug. Let me share a story. It's a short story about Dave. He's a prairie hider. I like to call him my friend too. You've all seen him, I would predict, because Dave, he volunteers out in the parking lot and greets people when they're coming in the parking lot. He's always looking for more friends if you want to help greet people in the parking lot. But I really got to know Dave about 2 years ago. Dave, on his journey, he decided it was time. It was time to publicly declare his relationship with Jesus, that he put his faith and his trust in him by getting baptized. And baptism is coming up. If any of you are feeling that nudge on your heart that maybe, hey, baptism is the next step for me, doing it at the beginning of October. You can go to Prairie Heights Connect or stop out at Next Steps or go on our website if you want more information. But Dave, he was feeling God speaking to him that he needed to get baptized. And when we do baptism at Prairie Heights, we ask people to share their story about, hey, how did you get to this point? You were there, and now you're here ready to publicly declare your relationship with Jesus. What happened and what brought you here? And when I read this, when Dave got baptized 2 years ago, it was just cemented in my head. So I want to share it with you. Here's what Dave wrote. I have a coworker that attends Prairie Heights and would often talk about it. My wife, she has several coworkers that attend Prairie Heights, and they would talk about it. We finally decided that it was a church that we should check out. At our first visit, we felt welcomed with high fives at the doors, greeters, and coffees. The live band blew me away. I'd never experienced that before at a church. The message, it was clear, and it made me want to come back to hear more. And it was during the last baptism that was really, really speaking to me, and I was feeling strongly that this was for me. And I wasn't going to turn back. I wasn't going to go back to where I was. I was only going forward. So when the opportunity to get baptized and start volunteering came up, I took that next step. Did you hear that first line? Let me read it to you again in case you missed it. I have a coworker that attends Prairie Heights and would often talk about it. My wife has several coworkers that attend and would hear them talk about it. We finally decided that we should try it out. Yes. People talk about church and God at work. And it only makes sense. Because if Jesus has had an impact on your life, don't you want to share it with other people? I don't know about you, but if I eat at a great restaurant in town and I had great service and the food knocked my socks off, I'm telling all my friends about it. Hey, we heard my friend do it with the brickwork. And I'm pointing over there because he usually sits over there at the 9 o'clock. He had a great experience and he shared it with someone else. And that's that second part of what God wants us to do. Just think about it. Just think about the people that you see in this spot week in and week out. Beth didn't always go to church, but someone she knew started talking to her about it, and then she came. I didn't always go to church. I didn't always go to Prairie Heights, but someone I knew started talking about it, and here I am. Doesn't mean if you start talking about Prairie Heights to other people that you have to work here. Just wanted to use those two examples. Don't let that scare you off. Just think about it. There's 100,000 people in our community, 100,000 people that aren't connected to God or a church. There's a lot of people out there to invite, and you can certainly do it. Here's your next step. Pick one. Pick year one. Who's someone? Who's someone that you know? Someone that you care about? Someone that you want good things for? Who's your one? Pick them. Pick them right now in your mind. I guarantee you most of you have had some name just flash through your mind. Pick them and invite them. In fact, I'll tell you exactly how to do it. You have a card on your chair. Grab the card. This was awesome at 9 o'clock, so it's going to be awesome again. Grab your card. Everybody grab a card. Grab a card. And there's part of it that tears off. And on the count of 3, we're all going to tear it off together, and we're going to hear the rip. Okay? I just like to hear the rip. All right? On the count of 3, you're going to tear it off. 1, 2, 3. Oh, that was a great sound. Now that little piece, put it in your pocket, put it in your shirt pocket, put it in your purse, and invite somebody. Invite somebody to come to church next week. I mean, it's the easiest time of the year to invite someone to church because as a church, we are laser focused on connecting with people and building community. And you know what? Sometimes people aren't ready to make that jump and just come to church. That's why it's such an awesome time to invite somebody. Because as part of that, as part of this new series about building community, we're having some neighborhood parties. I mean, we're having parties with food and games and fun. If maybe they're not ready to come to church, invite them to come to the party. Never been easier to invite somebody to get engaged with the church and God. I would ask you, though, have them RSVP, because there's no worse thing than throwing a party and running out of food. So if they are going to come, ask them to RSVP. You RSVP too, because we want to make sure we have enough food. And next Sunday, hey, we're even giving out awesome Prairie Heights bracelets. Everybody, we got bracelets for everybody, different colors, depending on where you live. Grab them when you come in. It's such an easy time to invite people to come to church. I just encourage you to do it. That's it. Pick your one and invite them to kick off Sunday. And do that. Do that when you're at work and you're working for Jesus. Let me say a prayer. God, thank you for this opportunity for us to come together on a Sunday morning. And God, I just ask that, hey, whatever you want each person that's hearing this, whatever you want them to hear and whatever you want to stick in their mind, in their hearts, God, just let that one thing stick and let the rest of it go away. God, we're all different. We all need something different this morning. God, meet us where we're at. And God, give us the desire and the inspiration to lean into meeting you and hearing what you had for us this morning. God, I just ask that you'll let us get through that nervous feeling, maybe the sweaty palms, and help us fight through that and invite people to come to church and get to know you, because we know what it's meant to us. And motivate us, inspire us, help us invite more people to get to know you. God, in your name we pray, amen.